What's going on, everyone? Samir and Samet here, and welcome back to our Formula One podcast.
Today we'll be talking about the 2023 Singapore Grand Prix.
And wow, what an incredible race! Just like last year. I mean, another incredible Singapore Grand Prix.
I mean, this race was just, oh my god, it deserves this.
Yeah,
Absolutely
yeah.
incredible race. By far the best race of the season we've ever seen so far.
Definitely.
And it was definitely because we saw a team heavily fall off, but not just because that team fell off.
Yeah.
We also saw just how close the field was. Like if it weren't for Red Bull, Singapore showed how close of a season this would have been.
Yeah, definitely. It was kind of nice, even though I'm a Red Bull fan, though, I have to admit, it was kind of nice just to see some good, close racing for once.
Yeah, exactly. So going into this weekend so far, obviously Verstappen had just come off of winning 10 Grand Prix in a row, which is absolutely phenomenal, and he was looking to make it 11 in a row this weekend. But the Singapore Grand Prix track had changed heavily. So after turn 15, there used to be two slow chicanes, turn 16, 17 chicane, and then the 18, 19 chicane. And that was like underneath the bridge and everything. So it kind of made the track a whole lot more slower. So this year, the organizers completely got rid of those two chicanes. And so from turn 15, it was a fast section. It was just a fast, long straight all the way to the new turn 16, 17 chicane, which used to be 20 and 21. Yeah. So it definitely made the track a lot quicker. I think it was around like 8 or 9 seconds quicker.
Yeah, a lot quicker. And also another thing going into this weekend too was that Red Bull had the chance, a very small chance, but they had the chance to seal up the Constructors' Championship this weekend. Obviously, that wouldn't turn out today, as we just talked about how Red Bull massively fell off this weekend. And going off directly into FP1, we saw there that Ferraris were actually looking pretty quick, but we didn't know for sure because obviously these conditions weren't similar to any of the race or qualifying conditions because it was during sunset, so the track temperatures and wind speeds and everything weren't exactly the same or around the same as during qualifying or the race. So we would have to wait till FP2 to get that real data.
Yeah, and I think also just FP1 once again, like they were trying to get used to that new section and everything, and they were also just trying to lay down rubber onto the track because this is a street circuit, so it's not used until these 3 days every year. So they're just trying to get more running into it and exploring kind of the different lines through the section, that new fast straight.
Yeah, we also saw in FP1 a new livery for the Williams team, obviously to celebrate their new partnership with Gulf that they had from the beginning of the season, and I quite like this livery. I mean, it's not the one that I voted for though. If any of you saw online on their Instagram or anything, the fans got to vote for 4 different liveries. This isn't the one I voted for, but definitely the one that I would vote for after.
Yeah, it definitely brings back like McLaren 2021 vibes, but it's not as good as that in my opinion, but it still looks pretty good.
Yeah, I don't think anything can beat that McLaren livery.
Exactly. Speaking of McLaren and special liveries, McLaren were another team to get a special livery. It was like similar to their old one, but instead of like the gray, it was replaced with completely black, like a matte black. So if you remember back to Silverstone when they had like orange and chrome, effectively replaced that chrome with a matte black, and that was their new, what they called stealth mode livery.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like what they had last year too, and they would be running it again for the Asia flyaways in Singapore and Japan. So it was a nice livery.
Yeah, McLaren were also in the hands of Lando Norris looking pretty quick. So in FP1, Norris finishing P4, but Oscar Piastri was down in P19, with of course Logan Sargent only behind. Obviously, no surprise there. But it seemed like only Norris could get a grip so far to the McLaren around this street circuit.
Yeah, obviously it's hard for Piastri too. I don't think Piastri has ever raced in Singapore.
Yeah, I don't think so.
He would be getting used to this track definitely. There was definitely a trend when I looked through the FP1 times that the rookies all seemed to be a lot slower because it was their first time coming to this track. But it was definitely an exciting track. Liam Lawson, who would be making his third ever start in Formula One, talked about how he always enjoyed this track and so it
Yeah.
was nice to see him getting to do this track for once.
Yeah. There was also a bit of problems with Alfa Romeo too. Alfa Romeo driver of Joe Gonyu having problems with his Alfa Romeo, saying that he smelled a funny smell inside his cockpit. So they had to call him into the box to see if anything was wrong. And once again, with street circuits like we've seen so far, traffic was becoming a big issue, and George Russell was obviously very upset about that because one of the Red Bulls were getting in his way at the exit of turn 3 it was, and just before that long straight before the turn into that long first DRS zone. So that would be another thing to look out for come qualifying.
Yeah, a lot of drivers like getting caught out with traffic here. It makes a big impact because
Yeah.
Singapore is pretty narrow and difficult to overtake on. So the drivers have to like stay well out of the way during qualifying. And
Yeah.
going back to Zhou Guanyu, it was also kind of ironic that he had problems this weekend immediately because he just
Yeah.
re-signed with Alfa Romeo for
Yeah.
2024. So I thought that was pretty funny. Like as soon as you re-sign, then you just
Yeah.
get problems. So that was funny. But also, again, we saw another incident of Godzilla on track
Oh yeah.
in FP1. It happened in 2016 when there was a lizard on the track, and the same thing happened this year. And so
Yeah.
it was just funny to see like all the drivers how they came up on the radio.
Yeah.
Like Verstappen was the one that encountered it in 2016, and then his engineer this year said maybe Godzilla had a baby.
Yeah, because he also ran into it again. He said there was a lizard again on the track, so he obviously remembered it from last year.
That
Yeah,
was pretty funny.
yeah. But come the end of FP1 now, it was looking good for the two Ferraris. As Charles Leclerc, former pole sitter in Singapore here in last year and in 2019, was P1 ahead of his Ferrari teammate Carlos Sainz. Verstappen was a tenth back in P3. Then came Norris, Hamilton, and Russell finding improved pace around Singapore compared to last week in Monza. Then Perez in P7, once again off the pace compared to his teammate, but which is very unusual considering his dominant win here last year.
Yeah, exactly.
So we know how well Perez goes on street circuits, especially this one. So he was 2 tenths off his teammate, but then again, it was just FP1. Then Fernando Alonso down in P8, Yuki Tsunoda in ninth, and then Esteban Ocon in 10th.
Yeah, this would be a big weekend for Perez because he
Yeah,
definitely needs to find some of his form back.
yeah,
And on a street circuit, he really needs it. But then again, we said the same thing in Monaco, and he put it in the wall in
yeah,
Q1. So we just need to see Perez's consistency.
yeah,
But going into FP2 now, Ferrari were proving that their speed was no fluke under
yeah,
qualifying conditions. Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc both topped the session, P1 for Sainz and P2 for
yeah.
Leclerc. So they were absolutely flying in the Marina Bay.
Yeah, definitely. Another team that was flying too was Mercedes with George Russell and Lewis Hamilton both up there in the top 5, and also Fernando Alonso and his Aston Martin was up there in P4. So both Mercedes powered cars were definitely showing some good signs of improvement. On that was a good thing in this session, especially because obviously now we're at the night time, so these conditions are going to be similar to the qualifying and the race. So that's definitely what they wanted to see.
Yeah, and once again we saw more traffic,
Yeah,
especially down at turn 13, right
yeah,
before the hairpin off the Anderson Bridge before the
yeah,
second DRS zone. We saw Carlos Sainz almost crash into the back of Max
yeah.
Verstappen, and I don't know what Verstappen was doing there. That should have been a slam dunk penalty in my opinion if that were in qualifying, but thankfully nothing happened. But Verstappen just seemed to stay out in the middle of the track there.
Well, I mean, if you looked at it quickly based on what I'm looking at, it looks like Verstappen, he sees signs is coming and then quickly darts over to the left and usually leaves. And there was some space there, but I think yes, he did move over too late, but he did leave some space on the outside. He did leave the racing line open, but Sainz decided to stay behind him a little bit longer than normal. So
Yeah.
I think that was a case of he kind of realized too late,
Yeah,
but.
maybe Sainz just thought he would block off the apex
Yeah,
there or something. But nevertheless, despite all that, Red Bull surprisingly were
yeah,
still off the pace here. So it was extremely confusing because Red
yeah,
Bull, on their way to win a sixth Constructors World Championship, they seem to be off the pace, not just off, but like massively off in
yeah,
Singapore. It was highly unusual.
Yeah, and in qualifying and race-like conditions too, definitely even more unusual. But if Verstappen was off the pace by that much, Sergio Perez just could not find anything out of his Red Bull, even on the soft compounder tires. He finished the session down in P7. He was ahead of Max Verstappen actually by a tenth, but he was struggling with the rear, saying he was stepping out every corner. So he was definitely having a lot of problems.
Yeah, he said he was gonna. He said he felt like he was gonna crash every
Yeah,
corner. So Verstappen, I think, did a better job with adapting to that, but still
yeah,
seemed like he couldn't put a better lap time together. So it was really strange, and it was kind of exciting to see maybe
yeah,
whether we would finally get an interesting race and interesting qualifying. Because
yeah.
at the moment, even although the Alpha Tauri seemed to be slower than them, it looked like maybe the sister team would do one better to
Yeah.
the reigning constructors champion.
Yeah, we also saw a scary incident with George Russell running wide at the final corner, trying to get to the line as quickly as possible and losing the rear end, but luckily just being able to catch it and not cause a massive shunt into the wall, as we would see later on this weekend, a driver losing the rear into that corner.
Yeah, speaking of on the edge, we saw lots
Yeah,
more incidents. We saw Kevin Magnussen. It was one of the Alpines. I think it was Esteban Ocon, and
yeah,
then Lance Stroll in the Aston Martin. So many drivers were tapping the wall. So it was like
definitely, yeah.
highly. It was definitely they're trying to find the limit, but thankfully none of them went over it because that would have been a nasty incident.
Yeah, Alex Albon and his Williams also got caught out with traffic right at the final corner, but luckily was able to keep going and didn't run into the back of the Aston Martin. But it just seemed like there was a lot of traffic at the final corner as drivers were queuing up, and also Albon seemed to have lost power too at the final corner, and they had to call him in, so that was not good for him to lose out on more valuable track time.
Yeah, and on the other side of the garage, Sargent was also struggling with the final corner, like you say. Like he was fighting lots of oversteer at one point through it,
Yeah,
so he was just trying to find the limit around this track because he's never
yeah.
been here, obviously.
Well, yeah, that's good. He's trying to find the limit as long as he doesn't crash out. That's
Yeah,
what Williams need him to do
yeah.
at this point. Just keep it out of the wall and try to finish as close to the top 10 as possible.
Yep. But in the end, it was both Ferraris 1 and 2 with Carlos Sainz ahead of Charles Leclerc, and then came George Russell in third and Fernando Alonso in fourth, showing that Aston Martin
Yeah,
probably has some pace around here. Then Lewis Hamilton came fifth, and Lando Norris came sixth, and then both the Red Bulls off the pace. Perez seventh, Verstappen eighth, and
yeah,
then Kevin Magnussen came ninth, and rounding off the top 10, it was Valtteri Bottas in the Alfa Romeo.
yeah. So now moving on into FP3 now. Ferrari made it 3 out of 3 this weekend after they topped FP3, and so that was really good from them. As Carlos Sainz this time was the one who was going quicker. He set the fastest lap time and beat his teammate Charles Leclerc. It was in it wasn't a Ferrari 1-2 this session. It was George Russell was up there in P2 for Mercedes, and then Norris was surprisingly up there in P3. But Carlos Sainz once again showing that he's the fastest one at Ferrari.
Yeah, Leclerc, although he wasn't too far off his pace, he looked like he was kind of struggling
Yeah,
with his car, like through turn one, especially. We saw one time he just was fighting lots of oversteer in some
yeah,
places and then understeer in the other. So it was like Leclerc had to dial it in if he wanted to get any chance of beating his teammate.
yeah. He was obviously making some mistakes throughout the lap as normal as we've seen, just like you said. But also Mercedes too were looking really quick compared to the other drivers like the other teams like Red Bull and stuff. So that's what they needed. But obviously we would have to wait again to see qualifying like conditions.
And also, we saw in this session that McLaren seemed to be getting in the mix too,
Yeah,
in the hands of Lando Norris, because he finished the session in third. And so it looked like it not only could be Ferrari and Mercedes, but maybe Lando Norris and the McLaren could bring
yeah.
things into it.
Yeah, and just for the third session in a row, Red Bull were not looking good again. Max Verstappen running wide at a corner and then running wide at the final corner as well. Just having to take the escape road. So just Red Bull not being at their normal Red Bull form.
Exactly, yeah. It was highly unusual to see, but it was also kind of exciting because
Yeah,
maybe like who knows, maybe Verstappen might be able to pull a lap out of his life like
yeah,
Hamilton did in 2018. But whether or not, I feel like we were in for really interesting Singapore Grand Prix.
yeah. Um, Also we saw more traffic issues with the Alfa Romeo, Valtteri Bottas too. But Bottas though was seeming to have a good session as he finished his session down. Actually, he didn't have a good session at all. Both Alfa Romeos had a pretty bad session, finishing P18 and P19. So both of them just struggling to find good laps together. And once again, Logan Sargent not having a good session at all, finishing down there right at the bottom.
Mhm. So in the end of FP3, Carlos Sainz finished first, George Russell finished second, and then Lando Norris finished third. So it
Yeah.
was three constructors in the top three,
Yeah,
and then came Verstappen fourth, and then Carlos Sainz or Charles Leclerc came fifth,
yeah,
and then Lewis Hamilton came sixth. Then Oscar Piastri was seventh, Perez eighth, Hulkenberg ninth in the top
yeah,
10 in the Haas, and then Yuki Tsunoda top 10 in the Alpha Tauri.
yeah. Great from Yuki Tsunoda again, pulling as much pace out of his Alpha Tauri as possible.
And it's an important thing for Sonoda too, because
Yeah,
in the last two weekends, I think in the race he's been beaten by Liam Lawson.
yeah,
So Sonoda definitely needs to step up.
yeah. So now moving on into qualifying, then we saw throughout like the mid part of qualifying, from the change from the first runs to the second runs, we saw Max Verstappen kind of holding up the queue. There was a green light at the end of the pit lane, but he was just sat there waiting, and Russell was complaining about it, and both Mercedes were not happy about it as well.
Yeah, I feel like that should have been a penalty
Yeah,
because Verstappen was impeding people, and so
yeah.
that's not what you're allowed to do under regulations.
Yeah, so now as the final laps finished completing, we saw Yuki Tsunoda flying throughout his lap and went top of the times ahead of Carlos Sainz by 3/10 of a second. So track evolution was certainly becoming a factor, and drivers had to get a lap in as quickly as possible. And Kevin Magnussen was also having a really good lap in his Haas, and he went up into P2. So when a Haas goes up into P2 and an AlphaTauri is P1, that's how you know you have to get a lap in.
Yeah, exactly. And Ocon couldn't really maximize because
Yeah,
he went fifth fastest, and Lawson was absolutely flying too. And obviously, Lawson needed to be flying because
yeah,
he was down at near the bottom. But across the line, he went fourth. He went ahead of Magnussen actually,
yeah,
but Perez couldn't even beat Sonoda's time. So
yeah,
Sonoda had really laid down a really good lap. Then
yeah,
we cut to Lance Stroll fighting oversteer through his Aston Martin through
yeah,
the new 16 and 17 corners, and
yeah,
then he fought some more oversteer through the final
yeah,
corner, and it was just too much, and he put that Aston Martin heavily into the wall, and immediately the red flag came
yeah,
out, and it was a really severe accident, and thankfully though Stroll was able to walk away.
yeah, and also great reaction times from both McLarens who were behind him to avoid hitting into him, and that just shows how much F1 safety has improved from how it was like 10, 20 years ago to now. Stroll was just able to get out of his car and walk away, so that was really good to see, and I'm really glad that he was okay. So that was a
Yeah,
very nasty crash.
I'm happy for Stroll too, but I mean he's been really inconsistent this
Yeah,
season. Now
yeah,
he's been thrashed by Alonso, and so I really feel like Aston
yeah,
Martin can't get anywhere unless they get two solid drivers
yeah,
like Felipe Drugovich, for example,
yeah,
and Fernando Alonso. So like Stroll on his day is good, but the problem is
yeah.
that he doesn't have a lot of his days.
Yeah. So obviously that ruined his qualifying session, and this one brought a red flag to the session, and so Stroll would finish the session out of Q1 and down at the bottom, just 7/10 off because he did have a lap time set, but that red flag also cost other drivers behind from improving their times, which meant that we lost Lance Stroll, Zhou Guan Yu, Logan Sargent, who actually looked like he was hooking up a decent lap together, and same with Oscar Piastri. He looked like he was definitely going to get through, and Valtteri Bottas. So both Alfa Romeos continued their practice struggles into qualifying. Maybe one of them would have gotten through without the red flag, but who knows?
Yeah, and also another thing we saw Yuki Tsunoda again
Yeah,
got impeded by Max Verstappen. So Verstappen twice was now like
Yeah,
under investigation for impeding, but
yeah,
surprisingly he didn't get any penalty after the session, and
yeah,
it was really weird because those were like two slam dunk penalties he should have received, and I don't know
yeah,
why the FIA didn't give him any, or the stewards I should say. But then it wasn't until later that the stewards actually came out and said that they made an error and Verstappen should have actually been
yeah,
penalized. So I don't know what's going on in the FIA, but they can't be slipping up like this again,
yeah,
especially favoring the championship leader like that.
yeah. I mean, I guess you seem pretty serious when you say that. I guess it's because you're a Ferrari fan.
Exactly. Yeah, we can't tolerate this. This is nonsense.
Yeah. So going into Q2 now, in the final runs of Q2, it was George Russell who was actually looking the quickest so far, with Alonso up there in P2, Sainz just in P3, and Max Verstappen was now on his way to set a lap, and so far he was down on his time in the first sector, so it wasn't looking good for him, and he had to get a good lap in because he was only down in P10, and his teammate was in P11 and also in the wall at turn 1, which brought out the yellow flag. But luckily he was able to keep it going. But that was Perez's chance of getting a good lap out. So Sergio Perez would be out of qualifying because he was down in P11. Max Verstappen, he set a personal best on middle sector, but he was still down on his banker time. So he needed to find a magical lap to get out of qualifying because Hulkenberg went up to P6, which pushed down Verstappen into the bottom five. And so as he rounded the final corner now to complete his lap time, Max Verstappen went up only into P10. So by 4 tenths, he missed out to George Russell's time of P1. But that was a pretty big margin, and only down in P10, which meant that he would almost certainly be at risk because others were definitely improving, such as Pierre Gasly. But Gasly was 5 tenths off Russell, and so he was out of qualifying as well. And Yuki Tsunoda crossed the line and behind his teammate Liam Lawson, because Liam Lawson crossed the line and by 7/1000ths of a second beat Max Verstappen's time, and Liam Lawson put his AlphaTauri into Q3.
Yeah, you might have to take a breath then. You were talking for a while. That it was absolutely incredible from Liam Lawson, the rookie, to put a lap to beat the reigning double world champion. It was an outstanding lap from Lawson in the AlphaTauri in just his third Grand Prix weekend appearance. That was phenomenal from Liam Lawson, and he
Yeah,
would be taking that car into Q3 for the first time
yeah,
this season because through the hands of De Vries and Ricardo, that car hadn't gotten into Q3
yeah.
until now. So Liam Lawson showing why he deserves a seat in Formula One there.
Yeah, and also we saw Carlos Sainz go to the top of the times just at the very end, right behind Yuki Tsunoda after Tsunoda crossed and completed his lap. So that was it for Q2, and the five that we lost from Q2 were Yuki Tsunoda, who didn't set a time, then Alex Albon, then Sergio Perez, Pierre Gasly, and then Max Verstappen.
Yeah, it's really shocking to see both Red Bulls out. I mean,
Yeah,
that was absolutely insane. I did not expect that. I didn't have that
yeah,
on my bingo card coming into this
yeah,
weekend because I really thought Verstappen would make it
yeah,
11 wins in a row, not P11.
yeah,
That was really interesting. Like, and it was both of them too, not just Verstappen. So it
yeah.
was a nightmare for Red Bull.
Yeah. Going on into Q3 now, the final runs or the first set of runs for Q3, it was Alonso who was quickest so far in P1, but then came the challenges of Lando Norris who went to P1 by nearly a second, so just a massive gap between the McLaren and the Aston Martin. And then but there was other challengers behind as Carlos Sainz crossed the line. He went up into P1 by 3 tenths of a second, so a lot bigger gap compared to what we've seen so far. And then Charles Leclerc crossed the line, and once again he couldn't beat his teammate.
Yeah, Leclerc was down by like 2.5 tenths, and
Yeah,
Norris actually had a really good lap because he was like close to Leclerc, but he was ahead of both Mercedes.
yeah,
And at the moment, it was Russell ahead of Hamilton, so it
yeah,
looked like it would be really close to see who would get pole because there looked like five legitimate contenders for pole.
yeah. As Russell crossed the line, he went up into P4. Then Lewis Hamilton crossed the line, and Hamilton went up to P5. So again, Hamilton being outperformed by George Russell as well.
So now going on to the final set of runs, Sainz was again improving
Yeah,
his time. He was finding pace everywhere, and so was Lando Norris. And Charles Leclerc, crucially
yeah,
though, was down on his teammate. So Leclerc would need to find something, as Sainz was rapid through the
yeah,
first and middle sectors. So Leclerc would need an absolute almighty middle sector and final sector. And
yeah,
Leclerc was finding time in the middle sector.
yeah,
As Sainz crossed the line, he extended his advantage to Leclerc by 4 tenths. Norris crossed
yeah,
the line. He actually beat Leclerc's previous time,
yeah,
but Leclerc was flying, and the Monegasque, who's been on pole for the past two Singapore Grand Prix,
yeah,
couldn't get it done by just 7 hundredths of a second. He was out
yeah.
qualified by Carlos Sainz.
Yeah, you could see when he crossed the line too. He knew that he didn't get pole. He kind of shook his head, and so that was he knew that was it for his chance of pole position. And then we saw the Mercedes were coming to finish their laps too. And as Russell crossed the line, he went up out of nowhere onto the front row after blitzing the middle sector.
Yeah, it was a stunning lap for George Russell, who just absolutely showed
Yeah,
the pace that Mercedes had. Because Lewis Hamilton, when he crossed the line, Hamilton only went fifth fastest, so
yeah,
3 places behind his teammate. But nevertheless, it was Carlos Sainz on pole and
yeah,
Ferrari on pole once again. This was Sainz's second pole in a row.
yeah,
And then George Russell came second, and Charles Leclerc was third. So Ferrari 1 and 3 with Red Bull outside the top 10.
yeah,
Then came Lando Norris fourth, Lewis Hamilton fifth. Then came Magnussen sixth, Alonso seventh, Ocon eighth, Hulkenberg ninth, and then Liam Lawson 10th in the AlphaTauri.
yeah. So now, moving on into the main Grand Prix. Some notes before the start were that Lance Stroll's car was withdrawn from the race because obviously of that major damage, but also Stroll himself was not feeling fully 100% enough to race, so he wouldn't be able to race this weekend. And also, Zhou Guan Yu's car was required to start from the pit lane after some changes were made overnight.
And also, apparently, overnight, the drivers were having a discussion with the FIA about possibly adding a DRS zone through
Yeah,
turn 15 and up through turn 16 to increase overtaking
yeah,
opportunities. And the FIA shut down that request. And so I think drivers, especially like Lewis Hamilton, were really upset by that decision because
yeah,
they want to be racing as close as possible.
yeah,
And the addition of that fourth DRS zone would have definitely helped that. But
yeah,
I guess the FIA, like, they shut down a fourth DRS zone in Australia a
yeah.
couple of years ago, so I guess that's why they did the same this year.
Yeah. So now moving on into the race start then. At lights out, it was a good start from George Russell, who initially looked like he was going to get past Carlos Sainz, but then Sainz just had that better second phase off the line. And then it was actually Leclerc who was looking like he was going to get past Russell. And into turn one, Leclerc did get past George Russell. And Russell was now under pressure from his teammate Lewis Hamilton, who had to run wide. So at the moment now, it was Sainz from Leclerc, Hamilton ahead of Russell, but he quickly gave that position back and then was under immediate pressure from Lando Norris.
Yeah, Hamilton obviously gave that position back to
Yeah,
Russell, but then he was attacking Russell all the way through
yeah,
the next straight, and Russell actually got behind Hamilton, and so he was coming under pressure from Lando Norris in the McLaren, and then the two
yeah,
Haas cars were getting involved with Esteban Ocon. I think it was
yeah,
Kevin Magnussen diving down the inside of Esteban Ocon, so
yeah.
that two Haas cars trying to fight their way into the points.
Yeah, and we also saw we saw Oscar Piastri trying to make a move with but getting into contact with one of the Alpha Tauris. It was the Red Bull of Sergio Perez. This was all happening in front of Oscar Piastri, but he made contact with Yuki Tsunoda, and that damaged Yuki Tsunoda's car. And Tsunoda unfortunately had to pull out into the escape road and had to retire from the race again.
Yes, Sergio Perez obviously, like, I
Yeah,
this was like not that wasn't a good thing from Sergio Perez. That was completely kind of a
yeah,
rookie error from Perez. Not especially to hit your sister team car. That was
yeah.
not at all good.
Yeah, speaking of rookie errors, on lap 20, we saw Logan Sargent just drive into the wall because he had nothing better to do. It was a right turn, so Americans with right turns once again just finding the wall, and that brought out the safety car because Sargent was just dragging his front wing all over the racetrack and just spraying carbon fiber everywhere.
And Leclerc got really unlucky with that safety
Yeah,
car because he had to wait not only for Lando Norris to get through, he had to wait for
yeah,
Hamilton to pass him. So Leclerc lost out big time to George Russell and to
yeah,
Lando Norris too. So it was absolute disaster for the Monegasque, and
yeah.
I was really annoyed at that.
Yeah, I bet you what. But Sainz took his lead, and both Red Bulls stayed out. So they didn't come in to change tires. So Verstappen was running in P2, and Perez was running in P4, and Russell was in between them in P3.
Yeah, we also saw an incident in that whole pit lane scenario where
Yeah,
Alonso, he was entering the pit lane but he just went a bit too
yeah,
wide and he actually bounced over the curbing between the pit lane entry and the racetrack, and then he bounced back over to rejoin the pit
yeah.
lane, and the FI specifically do not allow that, so that was a slam dunk penalty for
Yeah.
Alonso.
So now lap 23 is when they restarted the race, and Sainz had a very good restart, keeping Verstappen behind. And it was Verstappen, then Russell, and Perez was trying to keep up, but was under immediate pressure from Lando Norris, who just looked so much more quicker than Sergio Perez. And Perez was now Verstappen was being put under pressure throughout that new layout of the track on that same lap, and Russell was going down the inside of Verstappen and just made a really easy overtake on Max Verstappen, and even further back behind, Norris was now backing Perez up into Lewis Hamilton, and Hamilton just went down the inside of Sergio Perez, but Perez broke that much later and was able to keep his position.
Yeah, on lap 24, then through the second DRS zone, we saw Lando Norris into turn 14.
Yeah,
He made a move on Max Verstappen. He went completely around the outside of him, and that was a nice move for Norris to
yeah,
put him back up into the podium places. And you could definitely tell the Red Bulls were struggling because
yeah.
Hamilton had got past Perez, and Leclerc was right on the back of Perez, too.
Yeah, Hamilton was now on lap 27 looking to chase after Max Verstappen and make his move at the very first DRS zone. Hamilton went down the inside of Max Verstappen and went up into P4. So now it was two Mercedes in the top four, and now Russell was trying to put the pressure on Carlos Sainz. And on lap 37, we saw Fernando Alonso getting past Esteban Ocon and then getting past Sergio Perez. So now Perez was just struggling even more, but he made a very nice move and did the switchback on Fernando Alonso, and backed his teammate, backed up Alonso into his former teammate Esteban Ocon, and this was a very fun scrap to watch between the three of them as Ocon just went down the inside of Alonso, and then Alonso had to just hang it around the outside further, and then he was able to keep the position ahead of Ocon. But then Ocon just had much better traction and was able to get his spot back.
Yeah, it was a really nice battle to see between all
Yeah,
three of them because especially Perez was struggling, and so Alonso and Ocon
yeah,
were clearly much quicker, but it was effectively a question about who would get ahead, Alonso or
yeah.
Ocon. And then finally on lap 14, Red Bull decided to bring in
Lap
Max
41.
Verstappen, or
Yeah,
lap 41, yeah, sorry. They brought in Verstappen, but that brought him all the way down to around P14, and so that was like really
yeah,
like terrible luck kind of for Red Bull because they were hoping for another safety car to
yeah,
pit on Verstappen, but they just couldn't find that window. And then right then, near then, on lap 43, we saw Esteban Ocon pull
yeah.
over to the side of the track on the inside of turn 1 and 2, and that brought out another safety car.
Yeah, that's not what Ocon needed on his birthday. Just to be pulled over right there and to have smoke pouring out of his Alpine after what was looking like a very promising race so far.
Yeah, it was not. It was pretty sad birthday for Esteban
Yeah,
Ocon, but that actually brought out a virtual safety car.
yeah,
Excuse me. And Mercedes here decided to go for a gamble. They
yeah,
brought in George Russell and Lewis Hamilton
yeah,
with the hopes that they would easily chase the top four down again and or top three down again and
yeah,
pass them and take the win. And so it was another like sort of Hungary
yeah,
2019 Spain 2021 scenario,
yeah.
but this time with both cars, and they had to get past three instead of one.
Yeah, this is where the race really came alive, and this is where we would see the stuff. And on that same lap, the virtual safety car was ending right when Alonso was making his pit stop. It went green. And then on lap 47, we saw Max Verstappen trying to make moves on the Alfa Romeo in front of him of Zhou Guanyu. And he just went down the inside at the hairpin. It was a very nice move at turn 13. And that was a kind of trademark Verstappen move that we've seen so far.
Yep, on lap 53, then we saw George Russell catch up to one of his first of three victims that he would hope to have. He got past Charles Leclerc he did a switchback at turn 14, and on the run down to turn 16, he outdragged the Ferrari.
Yeah.
It was a nice move from Russell. And then on lap 54, the next lap, Hamilton went around the outside at turn 7 to get past Charles Leclerc. So both Mercedes were making really good progress to try to get past Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz.
They were pulling like a second and a half per lap too, so just the pace difference was incredible on the new tires. And by the time on lap 58,
that's what you expect with new tires.
I mean, yeah, but just we don't see that much usually. I guess it's because it's a street circuit, just that much more pace. Yeah. And because by the time on lap 58, they were just a second apart from the leaders. Russell was a second back on Norris, and Hamilton was a second back on George Russell. And we also saw on lap 58 Max Verstappen making a nice move around the outside of his former teammate Pierre Gasly and move up into P6.
Yeah, Verstappen was quietly fighting his way back up into the points. And also Liam Lawson was maintaining his position in P9, so keeping his Alpha Tauri in the points. Yeah. Lawson and Verstappen were both doing an incredible job, especially Lawson, though, putting that Alpha Tauri way up there when he was the sole Alpha Tauri remaining in the race.
Yeah, on lap 58, we saw Sainz. His engineer was telling him about DRS, and Sainz was saying that was on purpose to give Norris DRS so that that he could kind of pull along and so that he wouldn't back up everyone into them.
Yeah, it was so that Sainz could effectively keep Norris as a buffer between the fast flying Russell and Hamilton. And on lap 59, Russell was trying to make a move on Lando Norris around the outside at turn 14, but Norris very smartly placed his car on the apex, and he didn't allow Russell to get the switch back. But the Mercedes was trying to outdrag the McLaren all the way through turn 16, but the McLaren stayed ahead going into turn 16. And so all that was really helping Carlos Sainz maintain his lead, and that moment might have then sealed the win for him.
Yeah, but now moving on to the last lap, and you had 4 cars in the top 4 separated by a second and a half, all with the 3 with DRS on each other, and Russell was just trying to get past Norris. I think Norris knew by this point he wouldn't be able to get past Sainz, but I'm sure he was still trying. But Russell was now just trying to give it everything behind Lando Norris, and as they approached the turn off of the second DRS zone, it was, I think, turn 10 it was.
Turn 10, yeah.
We saw Lando Norris sort of tap the wall, but he got away with it. But George Russell directly behind, he tapped the wall even further, and he didn't get away with it, as we just saw riding on board with Norris, Russell in the background just slide off and slam into the track. And that was his challenge and his race over.
Yeah, I really felt bad for Russell then, but that was definitely a rookie error from him, something you wouldn't expect from George Russell, and that was like really just a heartbreaking moment for him and Mercedes. Definitely not Hamilton though, because he got a podium after that. Definitely not Norris or Sainz, because Russell was definitely the quickest one out of all 4 of them. But that was just really bad luck from George Russell, but it was self-doing, so it would be about how he picked himself up for Suzuka.
Yeah, my fantasy team crashed after that. But going on to the final lap now, the final corner, Carlos Sainz survived all of the pressure, and he survived everything behind to claim a maiden Singapore Grand Prix win and a second win with Ferrari. And Carlos Sainz won the Singapore Grand Prix, taking Ferrari's first win of the season and Ferrari's first win at Singapore since 2019. Yeah.
Finally, Red Bull have stopped winning, and finally it was Ferrari that won once again for the first time since Charles Leclerc in Austria in 2022. I was so happy after this, man. Finally, it wasn't Leclerc, it was Sainz. It was extreme maturity from Carlos Sainz, and
Yeah.
tactical brilliance by him and Ferrari.
Yeah.
For once, Sainz finally won. Norris second, a great result for
Yeah.
him and McLaren. And Hamilton showing consistency pays
Yeah.
off as he came home third. And then it was it was almost a photo finish at the line, but Leclerc just came home
Yeah.
ahead of Max Verstappen. Pierre Gasly picked up really good points
Yeah.
for Alpine, and he came home sixth. And then the other McLaren of Oscar Piastri.
Yeah.
Norris's drive was really good, but Piastri came
Yeah,
from like
definitely.
18th on the grid to 7th at the checkered flag. It was kind of what Ricardo did last year too.
Yeah.
So that was absolutely incredible from Oscar Piastri. Sergio Perez came home 8th, a disappointing 8th for him
Yeah.
and Red Bull. Liam Lawson scored 9th and points on his third
Yeah.
race in Formula One.
That deserves an applause.
Yeah, absolutely incredible from Liam Lawson. That was that car finally scored points
Yeah.
this year, and it was matched AlphaTauri's best result of the
Yeah,
year.
definitely.
And then Kevin Magnussen actually came back for P10 right then. He definitely didn't expect a point right there, but Haas would definitely take it.
Yeah.
So this Singapore Grand Prix just deserves
Yeah.
absolutely
Definitely,
incredible race,
yeah.
and it'll take something special to beat this race.
Yeah, and also it's worth mentioning Alex Albon, who was running in the points, but then Perez during the race just like tried to go for a move on him and ended up damaging his Williams, causing him to make an extra pit stop, and Albon just lost out on the points. So he drove a brilliant race, but just unlucky to miss out on the points.
Yeah, I think Perez got a 5-second
Yeah.
penalty after that. So just not good, not a good race at all from Sergio Perez, and we would have to
Yeah.
see how he bounced back. Otherwise, his seat would be in jeopardy for 2025.
Yeah. So that was it for this wonderful, incredible Singapore Grand Prix. And thank you guys for listening to this episode of our podcast. And be sure to join us next time as we take a look at the 2023 Japanese Grand Prix. Thank you.